I would like to discuss some news about the weaponized affair over there in Eastern Europe, because there is some news coming from the region involving other parts of Europe that I think is of some intrigue. Now, as usual, we have to be careful with what we say, lest we piss off the overlords who have an allergic reaction if we say something truthful, or dare question why a country that is supposedly winning needs an additional $40 billion fucking dollars. Now, many of you are aware, I am sure, that a lot of the world's grain comes from this part of the world, almost a third, I think, about 30%, and so the current conflict has put a damper on the exporting capacity, as well as potentially damaging other grain because there's no place to store it. And so even Germany and France has decided to talk to Putin and ask him to lift the grain blockade and engage in peaceful talks with Zalensky, to which Putin said, "We will allow your exports through the Black Sea." Methinks with the aid of Russian military, seeing as there are mines in the waters, but they must lift the sanctions, which Putin has described as an erroneous economic and financial policy of Western countries, as well as by the anti-Russian sanctions. So, strategic advantage to Papa Putin. I get no news from this from anywhere, mind you. The only one on my Twitter feed that speaks on this via the footage is the Daily Caller, which is right-leaning, and even there, all the comments are urging the Daily Caller to please stop this crap because no one believes the footage. Hell, there's a few of the comments who could identify what game the supposed footage is even from. And something to note, and this is to keep in mind. During the Maidan protests, where Yanukovych fled to Russia after the EU deal with Ukraine went up in smoke, it was Yatsenyuk who was put in power by the Americans. That's who they wanted. That famous phone call with Victoria Nuland where she says, "fuck the EU," because the EU didn't want him. They wanted Klitschko. After Yatsenyuk becomes PM, Poroshenko was elected into power as president. And then Zelensky ran against the corruption of Poroshenko. Even though he himself is a multimillionaire, he's caught around palling with the WEF and hanging out with Pelosi and McConnell, the nexus of corruption of the United States. So the whole entire debacle is a fucking joke. And Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in all of Europe. I was watching Lex Friedman talk with Oliver Stone, and he said he gets the feeling most of these countries don't have sovereignty. And he's right, they don't. That's why I'm laughing my ass off at all of the idiots who say, "Oh, Ukraine is fighting for sovereignty." Are they fuck? They aren't fighting for sovereignty. They're getting flooded with outside weapons and money. You think America gives a fuck about other nations? Get real. Ukraine is a vassal state and Zelensky is a puppet. They're fighting to retain American influence, and that's all. I find it so bizarre that so many bought into that whole Russian narrative for 4 years, the remnants of which are still used to perpetually fool many of the idiots who bought into the propaganda that this is all somehow Russia's fault and the US has no part to play in any of this. And a lot of those same people hate America, but for some reason are now totally on board with them opposing Russia, even though ideologically they would be much more aligned with the old Soviet Union. What a topsy-turvy world we live in indeed. But Russia now seems a lot more hell-bent on using what you could call aggressive defense to squash out the perverted neoliberal influence the American regime is pushing on the world. It's why more aggressive preserving conservatives like Viktor Orban in Hungary gets praise from people for telling the neoliberal influence to fuck off. I gets called authoritarian in the same breath, even though he got a massive voting majority, but we all know how that one story goes. If you wish to use the state power to actually conserve something, then you're some kind of authoritarian, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But having said that, the American conservatives, and to a lesser extent the rest of the West as well, seem to have this heavily ideologically driven aversion to using state power. Given the incompetence of democracy, this is admittedly an understandable position. However, if you don't wield the power in other institutions that hold large quantities of influence, say, how exactly do you hope to conserve anything? This is why humans gravitate towards strong men, single leaders. It is natural. It's the most common form of society in our species. But I think the world, especially America, have clearly underestimated just how much the world is dependent on Russia and Ukraine for resources, Europe especially, our countries being neighbors for much of Russia. Which brings us to an interesting junction. Now, I could be easily wrong about this, but this is just my perspective. Zelensky is clearly the American pawn. He's a symbol of American influence in the region. Russia and Europe is much more tied via resources, the wheat and fuel, for example, than Ukraine and America. Because again, we still have no fucking answer from anyone in the mainstream media about what the hell America is even doing in Ukraine. You can infer from the silence on the matter their presence is not exactly one with benevolent intentions, that much is clear. So I want to bring this up. Thank you to Michael Tracy for this. Let's zoom in here. Since yesterday, Transatlantic Forum near Prague, many participants are former and current government officials, former and active NATO officials, almost all from CEE, Baltics, UK, and US. Some observations from outside the Berlin bubble. Remember all the naysaying idiots who said this has nothing to do with NATO? Even though it clearly does, because NATO is not a defensive treaty, it is an imperialistic arm of the Yanks. Everyone here is convinced that Ukraine is fighting not only for itself, but for all Europeans. Their fight is our fight. Many here from Central and Eastern Europe feel that they will be next if Putin is not stopped. Again, not exactly the rhetoric of someone who is winning now, is it? There is much less concern about unintentionally setting in motion a spiral of escalation. No references to World War III, widely shared conviction that the probability of a Russian nuclear strike is low. Okay, question for all of you listening here. Does that make any sense to you? Oh, sure, Ukraine is winning and they're fighting for all of Europe because if Russia isn't defeated, they are going to start reconquering Eastern Europe. But we don't foresee an escalation. Come again? That, in my book, is a declaration of war against Russia. How the hell is that not seen as an escalation? Hell, even MAGA fans were pissing me off with Putin shutting off energy to, I think, the Netherlands? And a few of them said, oh, I seem to recall someone warning about this. And I'm there thinking, you disingenuous bunch of bastards. You fuck around in Russia's backyard, you expand NATO while ignoring their cries repeatedly, arm Ukraine, why? Paint Russia into a corner, limit their options, and you're surprised they bite, and surprised they counter when you slap sanctions on them. And then I see this.
In 2021, we kept reiterating that Ukraine was going to join. We kept saying that over and over again. So our diplomats are lying?
Yes.
Yes,
that's the real world, guys. Come on, come on.
But you could.
That's the real world.
Wait a sec. Our diplomats are lying all the time, yet the Russians should trust them when they offer assurances.
Bear in mind, this bloke was a former ambassador to Russia who openly admitted the US lies, and bizarrely gets a round of applause for that. The more information I see from the Americans about this, the more the needle for me is shifting towards one side. Because the astounding fucking arrogance from the Yanks, as if they have nothing to do with this mess, is utterly repulsive to me. Now, don't take this as gospel, but I am not surprised it was France and Germany that spoke to Putin. They're the big head honchos of Europe, after all. And I get the impression there's a fair few in Europe that do not like all of this American meddling in the region, and they want America to piss off, because all of this is America's bloody fault. And now this is putting Zalensky in a precarious position, because on the one hand, America has no intention of any concessions with Russia at all. America does not like any rivals, that is their mentality. And parts of Europe seem to be sort of fed up with this, not only rocking the boat with regards to resources they'd otherwise smoothly get, for the most part, but also angling the Europeans to get resources from other places that isn't in Eastern Europe, like America, for example, which again makes places rely on America, who've already grown fat and gorging themselves with too much fucking power, what with the bloody Americans rearing their ugly heads in places they clearly don't belong. So I can imagine, or pray maybe, that there are a few European leaders who are looking at this insane desire by the Americans who are stuck in the Cold War mentality with this disastrously piss-poor leadership hell-bent on accelerating the escalation in the situation, and ask themselves, what the hell do we gain by doing this? And perhaps Europe can have a conversation in the wake of this conflict about weaning themselves off of America's crumbling half-ass excuse for an empire. Best thing I'd like to see come out of this is the unipolar power of America getting severed and a less incompetent corrupt force emerging to challenge them. If only Britain wasn't so incredibly cucked and weak, it would have been nice to see a restart of the old British Empire. Rule Britannia. And that's all for today. Until next time.